Hi everybody, welcome to Geeks in Our 30s. I am Dr. Kipp Antonio, and with me...
I'm Dan Lindeman. How's it going, everybody?
And so what we're going to be talking about today is a really interesting, fun little concept that Dan and I like to call, so that's where you drew the line? And what that's what you drew the line is, it's inspired by the Carrie Fisher Last Jedi moment where, spoiler alert, Carrie Fisher uses the Force to fly back to the ship to save her life. There's a couple of unrealistic things that go on in that scene. One is that she survives in the vacuum of space for a good minute and a half. And then the second one is that she's able to use the Force to pull herself back. But the hilarious thing about when you do stuff like that in your mind is that you have to recognize the inherent hypocrisy of that's where you're drawing the line. Not that the people can use magic powers or that people, can trick people by waving their hand in front of them, or the fact that they can use rockets and fighter jets to go across space, even though they everything is junky mechanical stuff. But how she used the Force in that scene, that's what broke this for you. And so we're going to be talking about that scene and that hypocrisy that geeks often fall into. And we're going to be talking about some of me and Dan's specific favorite reactions of when those kinds of things have happened in movies before. So,
yeah, so if you're not sure if you're in one of those moments, it's usually the one where you mutter under your breath, "That's so dumb," or you look to somebody in the theater with you or on your couch with you, and you're just like, "Are you seeing this?
Yeah.
Is this happening?" That's sort of the telltale of how you know when you're in you've just crossed a line that you didn't know was going to be there. Mm-hmm. And so, you drew the line there. So we're definitely inspired to talk about this by that episode from Star Wars, but it was not the first time that I ran into it.
Yeah. So, Dan, why don't you give us your first example and what movie it's from and talk about the scene and how it happened.
Sure. So early in college, I was watching the Chronicles of Narnia with a group of friends, and it was actually a friend of a friend. So I don't know this person terribly well, so I don't know how geeky or what their level of involvement in the universe was. But Chronicles of Narnia, for the uninitiated, you go into a wardrobe. There's a magical fantasy land that has satyrs and a talking lion, and Santa Claus gives people bows and arrows. And so, which is a lot. Well, right. If we're talking about an episode where it's a bridge too far, you're very far on the bridge.
Right. Once Santa is providing weapons for children to kill evil witches and woodland critters, you're pretty far down the fantasy line.
Right. And so we're all kind of in this. Our disbelief is elsewhere. It's been suspended. It is above us right now. And there was a scene where they're in a battle, and the oldest boy, I think Peter, he's got a sword from Santa, and he blocks the blow of a minotaur. And the person I was watching the movie with was just like, nope, that's stupid. That couldn't happen, and just walked out. We had to pause and go get him because it was just too much. Which is ridiculous, right? Because we had Santa Claus giving people presents. We had a whole fantasy world with satyrs and talking lions inside of a closet where these four children are sort of important heroes. But that was too far.
Yeah. So let's take it apart a little bit, Dan, because I mean it's not as simple as just being being stubborn or being oh, I'm hyper realistic. There's a couple of underlying kind of psychological things that are going on that are worthy of paying heed to before we go further in the conversation. The first one is how seriously geeks take the rules in a game or a universe that's been established. And that is a really important thing. So the going through the wormhole that's in the back of the wardrobe, Aslan being Jesus in the Chronicles of Narnia, the witch being evil and being able to cast everlasting winter, that's all within. But there's at no point is Peter given super strength, or are we told that minotaurs are weak?
Right. And I think a lot of it has that sort of you have this responsibility of packing things up that have expectations with them.
Right.
And at first I totally thought that It was ridiculous that he'd walked out. It was like, you drew the line there, like that was the thing that broke it.
Right.
But in a lot of ways, I mean, right, Peter is never I assume it's Peter. It's probably not. So somebody in the comments will tell me who it actually was if his name wasn't Peter.
Yeah.
But yeah, and we're not told any of this extra information, which is crucial for this scene to sort of physically work in the universe.
Right, and it's also one of those things that you feel like if the writers, directors, people who are making that scene had been more like paying attention, they would have caught. But then the other part of your brain is like, well, who cares? Like this whole thing is kind of ridiculous. So you end up doing this like baby with the bathwater thing internally. Where you're like, well, everything else is ridiculous. Why am I picking out this one thing? And so
right.
Anyway, I just
there's actually
go ahead.
There's a quote from a physicist, which was I have to imagine it was Richard Feynman, who was talking about like what's normal. Mm-hmm. And he's like, we fly around in space on a rock going a couple thousand miles an hour, and it like in the vacuum of space is around a giant ball of explosion all the time. Is anything normal? Mm-hmm. And so I think to that point, is that sort of a get out of jail free card? Like, if you don't want to throw the baby out with the bathwater, then do you have to accept that, like, well, this is the author's universe?
Right. I mean, is part of it also, like, you could also invent more, like, I think a lot of times they do this too. You could invent more story. Like, is there something about Peter's sword that gives him super strength? Or has, like, the Minotaur just never been challenged before? Like, he's never been blocked, period. Like, he was like a savant. He was like a savant Minotaur in Minotaur school.
Yeah.
Like, he
Minotaur just studied the arts of axecraft.
Like, and he's been just pounding on people for years, and no one's ever had the audacity to block him. It's kind of like, Dan, in that episode of The Adventures of Pete and Pete, where there's paper cut, and no one will ever throw scissors against him. And then finally, yeah. So basically, what I'm trying to say is there's an analogy between The Adventures of Pete and Pete and going to Minotaur school. So
yeah, I think that's basically the main thesis of where we're going with this. Okay. So I hope everybody's kind of getting a sense for the space here, because I think it's a ripe space. Do you remember the first time that you and I together came across this phenomenon?
Yeah, so you and I together were living together in college, and there was this scene in, I think it was the second Pirates of the Caribbean movie. Maybe it was the first one. But there's this scene where Johnny Depp is doing crazy acrobatics, and this wheel starts, like, rolling. It's a giant wheel, and it's going like this. And somehow Johnny Depp, like, ends up falling and swinging and landing on top of it, and then, like, running along with the wheel to, like, kind of make the wheel go, and then he's staying away from everybody. And one of our friends was just like, that's so unrealistic. I would never, like, he could never do that. Like, the physics wouldn't work. And that was the first time that we were both like, but that's where you drew the line, huh? Like, yeah. Of all the things that you have seen in this movie, the gold that turns people into skeletons under the moonlight, like, this drunken pirate who, like, can just, like, seemingly escape any situation, like, against the best military in the world. Like, that scene, like, that wheel not working and the physics not happening, that's what, like, that's what killed it for you?
So I think in that one, it's even a little bit stranger, because, I mean, that's actually something that I would expect out of swashbuckling. Mm-hmm. Like, that could be a ridiculous thing, you use the plank, you can jump on a plank, like the pirate's plank, you could do a jump like that. Mm-hmm. But I do think that in that particular scene, there was a little bit more of a sense of urgency. And I think maybe that one felt too dopey, mm-hmm. and it was a little bit out of place. Do you think there's any bit of, like, out of placedness in these that kind of ruins it, or?
I'm sorry, but my natural thing right there, Dan, is to go, that's where you drew the dopey line? Like, that was too dopey? Not the pirate who walks around like, whoa, what to do? Like, that's where you drew the dopey line?
I think that's the other part of that's where you drew the lines that are amazing, is you can find at any point in time as soon as you've got a sense of incredulity, that it's like there's a line that has been crossed, and you're defining what was too much and what was too little. Right. I think there are a ton of great examples of this.
All right, well,
Like
let me go to another one then, just to kind of keep us moving here for a second, Dan. With the another one for me that was really, really intense is like I loved The Matrix. You know, like I loved The Matrix. I like obsessively watched it. When the second one was announced, I freaked out. Me and a buddy of mine like literally dressed as agents from the movie and wore that outfit to school, left school early, got in line to the theater early because we lived in a town that had like one theater, and like waited in line for hours to get into the tickets to watch the movie. But the part in the Matrix movies that was just so unrealistic, and there was lots, but is at the end of the movie when Neo is outside of the Matrix world, he's like in the real world, and the Sentinel is like coming after him, and he sticks out his hand and he's like, I can feel them, and he stops the Sentinel like in the real world. I just remember being so like, this, that doesn't make sense. And then it just made like all of the universe like kind of unravel. It was like somebody pulled the one thread that was going through the whole thing, which the whole premise of the Matrix is you can, when you're in the Matrix, if you realize you're in the Matrix, you can do whatever you want. And so that was my moment of like, that drew the line. Not the fact that like there's a separate world where like nuclear like holocaust has occurred, and like
but still rave dance parties.
And there's still
maybe yeah. Always
dance.
Happens. You know, first thing I think of afterwards. No, I think that one was a similar. It was almost the exact same as the Narnia situation, which was like, you never told me that this was possible in the movie. Mm-hmm. Like there was never like a setup to that explanation. I think one book series that handles this really well is actually the Dark Tower books. Mm-hmm. Typically halfway through at the end of most of the Dark Tower books, sort of Stephen King will unzip reality and say like, but actually this.
Right.
And I think things do really well when they do that. But that's sort of the premise of those books.
Right.
That's probably 8 or 9 episodes to themselves.
Do you think part of it, though, Dan, do you think part of it is that is how intense the violation connects to how essential the rule was to the universe? Like the Minotaur being blocked was not a major thing. You know what I mean? It wasn't like, oh, actually, Aslan's evil. You know, like that would be like it corrupts everything. Versus, I feel like the Matrix thing. Like the core, basically the core component of the Matrix is that idea, and by doing that, it like really unravels everything. So maybe
I on a nerve here. I think that's actually really, really close to where the line drawing happens, because the Narnia one's pretty nitpicky. The Pirates one's a little nitpicky, but like Carrie Fisher changing the fundamental aspects of the Force that we know, right? I mean Is that not a pretty central tenet of Star Wars? Is the Force and its usage?
And so I think that is I think that's it. I think that like how close to the essential rules of the universe, and then it kind of begs the question like, how do you know what the essential rules are?
Okay. Because I'm trying to think of like other examples that were things that were ridiculous. And yeah, any of the ones that are sort of really nitpicky are ones that don't challenge the fundamental, like, you know, what does it mean to be in this universe? And I think the way that you handle that in storytelling is probably the most delicate thing. And like we talked about Dark Tower a little bit, and the way that Stephen King handles setting those things up is by leaving little glimpses of the fact that there will be like a broken world later, that it's going to be revealed, that it's sort of so I think probably the most interesting example of this where it's like this was shown off. But not in this way. Do you remember in I think it was Days of Future Past where Magneto? I think you know what I'm talking about.
Yeah. He like moves. He moves the stadium.
Yeah, and so I don't think that is nitpicky because I think we had established sort of what Magneto can do. Right. And he's a very powerful mutant. He's we should probably put it on the screen somewhere, the scene where he lifts an entire stadium with his powers. So we're okay with Magneto being very powerful. We've been explained that he can control metal. But the stadium isn't exclusively only metal. And Why that building? I mean, it was a ring, but there's like ways in and out. There are nitpicky parts of this, but it's the magnitude of the power that's unrealistic.
Right. Right. And even when Xavier like does the thing where he can like tap into every human mind in the world, he does it by using his mutant power plus cerebral, which is like his little machine that he uses to amplify his mutant power. So they're not just like, oh, Xavier's power is mind reading, so he can mind read one person, or he can mind read 6.3 million or billion people. Like, they put a limit on it, and the only way they can do that is they provide like a story element that amplifies his powers. Versus in that moment, like having Magneto lift an entire stadium is so far beyond what you would think his capabilities are that it calls into question if anybody could ever beat him. Like, how can Wolverine stand a chance against somebody who could throw a skyscraper into somebody?
Right. Like, it's heal all you want. Or in the particular case with Magneto and Wolverine, there's a lot of fun play that happens there. But yeah, so you have to have some hints left behind, some breadcrumbs that this could be a possibility, I think. And most of the ones we've talked about are just egregious examples of like there was no precursor for this. There was no pretense for this happening. And so you can draw the line, and you can have ham-fisted scenes. I'm definitely reminded of shield surfing in Lord of the Rings, when like it was just like, well, this is dumb. But I mean, that actually is fine. It's doofy, and it was sort of like poorly handled, but it didn't do any. There was no telling me that this would have happened. But the good examples, would be something like Dark Tower or. Gosh, I'm trying to think of ones where it was like, oh, we're going to change the fundamental way that the universe works, but I let you know that was going to happen beforehand.
Right. Yeah, I don't know if I can think of any off the top of my head, but actually, Dan, what I just thought of, which was pretty interesting, is there's another one in Lord of the Rings, but it's not a case of something happening, it's a case of something not happening, which is the Eagles taking the ring to Mordor. Which everyone was like, why didn't the Eagles just do that? And there's lots of theories on the internet. People have made videos for why the Eagles couldn't do that, or why Gandalf wouldn't do that, or wouldn't choose to do that. But again, there's a hole in the plot. Even though there's there's an all-seeing eye who has an army of orcs, and he has a ring. And if some people put on the ring, they become basically omnipotent, but other people just turn invisible. But when you turn invisible, he can see you. So you're not really invisible. And so there's all this that's the reality, but for some reason everybody just has this well, they should have brought the ring in the most efficient way to Mordor. And so why wouldn't they just have these Eagles do it? That's another one of those well, if you had, because there's a desperation in Lord of the Rings. And having something come in that was so efficient, it's the equivalent to me of all of a sudden if Frodo had a machine gun. And it's
we've been set up to have this. Yeah, it's desperate. There's very few people. There are, 9 things going out into the world, and that's all we've got. That's our best chance. And even their best bets are temporary holdoffs, right? The Battle of Helm's Deep, right? It's a temporary hold off distraction. Right, the battle outside of the gates of Mordor is a distraction, so that the hobbits continue. Right, where you get the Eagles doing it, and it's oh, well, they're just super fast, and we didn't even really need that much of a distraction because they probably could have done it in 5 minutes. Or if you really wanted to do the whole, and I think a lot of this is the apologist of the Tolkien apologist, which is, well, the Eagles wouldn't have had the will to resist the ring. Well, it's why not just have the Eagles carry Frodo then?
Right.
If we know he's got magical will to resist it, he can still ride an eagle, right? That's still okay. He rode, presumably, or maybe he did walk. I feel like he could have rode a creature while he was wearing the ring, and that wouldn't have affected by proxy. I don't think that's how it was never set up in universe, so I wouldn't be shocked.
Right. But again, it's one of those things that it goes so again. The reason people notice it so harshly is it's like somebody game genied the movie. All of a sudden, the whole premise of the movie is just you have to walk for 10 years to get to this place. so you can throw the ring in, and the ring is sapping your energy, and there's ring wraiths that are after you, and you're constantly in survival. And just kidding, there's actually a jet that could take you there.
Yeah, the entire time. So yeah, I think this is like an amazing space to play around in. There's infinitely many examples in geekery. I just want to get a good idea of, why do you think that geeks do this? What is particular about the like rule consistency to geek culture? Is there anything there? Because I think we do accept kind of a lot, but I don't know if there's a good reason why these things are more upsetting, or if there are there's probably the non sci-fi fantasy. You drew the line there is in romantic comedies during the breakup, when they could just talk to each other,
right?
And it's like, why don't you just actually wait for like a minute because they were talking. I don't know that I've ever been in a situation in my life where it was like, well, just come back, and somebody just like won't.
Yeah,
I guess I've never seen somebody that great. But it was always like, well, can you just let me finish a sentence? Yeah. And most people would be like, oh yeah, I'm sorry. Yeah, it was super. It was like a misunderstanding.
Right.
I don't know. I wonder if this is similar to that, but it's just fantastical.
Yeah. Well, I think it's partially because the common element of like geekdom is escape. Right? And you're escaping into a video game, you're escaping into a movie, and that there's something better outside of where you are. So if, going back to kind of like when you think of like what a fundamental geek person is there's something you're fantasizing about that is more than you. Why a Jedi is so appealing is that they are not like super strong or macho or masculine. Like the biggest guy isn't the toughest Jedi. They're like monks, and through like careful study and practice, they become powerful, which is kind of the opposite of being a jock. Right? And so I think that the piece about it is that other world feels controllable and like acceptable, and like there's rules and everything makes sense, versus the real world is full of ambiguity, and like you don't have sure things, and there's no rules. And so all of a sudden when your fantasy world has rules violated once they've been set up, it's like internally anxiety provoking for people. I don't know, that'd be maybe my thought.
Yeah, and I think that's kind of where I'm settling on it too, which is, it is ridiculous when you think about it in the grand, and that's what also the Feynman, I think it's Feynman anyway, quote from earlier, which is what does normal even mean? But I think the reason that these moments are sort of so sacred or so controversial in geekdom is that we do have these worlds built up that are our escapes, that are our fantasies, that are these things that we sort of draw on to give ourselves solace, to give ourselves an escape, to or just have fun with it. And the careful crafting of a rule system and of a universe is a very very special art. And I think you're absolutely where I'm going to wind up falling on this topic, which is I built this world in my mind because I really liked it, and an inconsistency is very upsetting. Because this is more than it's more than the physicality of that world. It's more than, hobbits walking in Mordor. It's more than monks with laser swords. It's more than cyberpunks inside of a computer. It's, it's something that allows me this escapism. And so when you get jarred back into reality, that's always those are the worst lines to realize you're crossing over.
Yeah, and I think it even happens when in other things outside of geekdom. I think if you get into like a purely cognitive perspective, it's also like people don't like things that mess up their cognitive scaffolds. Like if you've got things in a box, like people really like that because it makes it easier to think about. I'll give you two examples that I think like really messed with me, or just mess with people in general. The idea of imaginary numbers in math. Like, right, you have this rule that, like, you can't square, what is it, like, you can't take the square root of a negative number? Is that what
Yep.
Yeah, right, you can't take the square root of a negative number. And it's like, oh, okay, yeah, good, that's a good rule. Like, I can see why that makes sense. And then all of a sudden it's like, you know how we told you that? You actually can, and it's this other thing called an imaginary number, and you're like, but math is solid. and things always add up, and like you can bring math into the real world, and like if I have a number of something and I like count it or divide it, it always works. It's consistent. Unlike my father, who no, I'm just kidding. But you know what I mean? It's just like it's consistent all the time. And so all of a sudden when you introduce something like imaginary numbers, you're like, that doesn't work. Like that doesn't fit the universe. And then, of course, you learn it really does, like, in the larger sense. But in that immediate moment, it doesn't. And I think it's the same thing with, like, grammar mistakes. Like, people who are really into, like, correcting grammar. It's like, oh, I before E except after C. Except in this word. Because that's like, oh, now I have to remember this special exception. So I had my compartment in my head about, like, the I before E except after C. But then I have to have this special extra box that has like these 5 other words in it, and I think that just like it's more taxing mentally. So I think that's another part of it outside of the escapism. So
definitely was the case. I remember actually specifically with imaginary numbers, I was like, I remember in high school just being like, you're making this up now. Like you're just this is. If I wanted to read fantasy, I would just go home and read fantasy. But as a mathematician, turns out that's the way you get them into the real world. So yeah, I think that's where we drew the line. And I think to draw a line in this episode, tell us about lines that you've seen drawn. Let us know in comments about, awesome stories, because I think they're really funny stories no matter what, even now that we've kind of analyzed them down to the nth degree here. But comment on us on your line drawing stories. If you like what we said, that's great. You probably hated what we said, so tell us in the comments. Kipp, any final thoughts?
Yeah, I really want to know what people's thoughts are. I really want to know what people think are like, what are those lines for people? What are moments in fantasy that people find unrealistic or annoying? And just take them apart. And I really like that little rule we kind of came up with, is that the more fundamental the violation to the story or to the rules of the universe, like the more intolerable it is. That's something that I think is a really cool, like a little piece of fruit that came out of our conversation. So anyway, so like us, subscribe, all that good stuff. I'm Dr. Kipp Antonio.
And I'm Dan Lindeman. Thanks for joining us again. Take care.
Right. Bye-bye.